In this first video from War, Art and Visual Culture London, Dr. Paul Lowe from University Arts London talks to two very well-known photographers, Simon Norfolk and Donald Webber. I hope you enjoy this video.
I'm Vivian Jabri. I'm a professor in the Department of War Studies. So I'd like to welcome you all to our department and to King's College London to this great day. Now, none of this symposium would have happened without our visiting fellow, Kit Messham-Muir. Kit is from Curtin University, which is on the west coast of Australia, in Perth, somewhere that's very far away. We know that. And we're very lucky to have Kit here with us because you can see what a rich program we have today. It's a mixture of panels, as you've seen, and conversations that are coming up very soon now. We'll start the first one almost immediately, but I'd like Kit to say something about the symposium, how he came to be here, and his interest in art and conflict.
Great. Thanks, Vivian. So this is part of a larger project called Art and Conflict, which is a 3-year project that is a partnership between Curtin University and the ECI. It also includes Professor Charles Green, who is a former official war artist in Australia. Anna Carden-Coyne from, in fact, it's just trying to creep in, I've mentioned her name, who's from the University of Manchester. Ryan Johnston from University of Melbourne, Uros Chivoro from UNSW, University of New South Wales Art Design, and two of the lead curators at the Australian War Memorial. And really what the project started out looking at the conflicts and the compromises that happen when official war art is commissioned and acquired by government institutions. But really we wanted to make it much more an exploration of what contemporary art and visual culture is today, dealing with war, conflict and political violence. For today's, this is actually one of now 3 symposia that we're putting on. So the very first one, as you can see from the banner there, which is now kind of out of date, the first one was in Sydney on the 25th of February this year, and a few people here today actually came to that. We have the one today, obviously, and then on the 17th of August, we have a 3rd symposium in Los Angeles at the Torrance Art Museum. So it's a great way of trying to kind of survey the current thinking. The previous incarnation was a call for papers that was then, we had a call for papers and the sessions were 20-minute papers, etc. I wanted to try something a bit more interesting today in terms of having conversations and discussions. And I've just been absolutely bowled over by the level of expertise and high-profile people that we've got today. So thank you everyone for agreeing to be part of this and being involved. So I just have some thanks. Oh, I should say also before I do that these symposia are part of this 3-year project, and that also will include a curated exhibition at the Australian War Memorial in 2021. There is a special issue of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Art coming out in the middle of next year. That is as a result of the Sydney Symposium. And Uros Chivoro and I are currently, and this is actually what I've been doing here at King's, working on a monograph about contemporary art and war at this present time. In fact, one generation after 9/11, which will be out in 2021. So I want to thank today's session chairs and conversationalists. I want to thank Professor Vivian Jabri, King's College London, Professor Anna Carden-Coyne, University of Manchester, Max Horton and Dr. Paul Lowe, University Arts London, and Magda Keeney from the National Portrait Gallery. I also want to thank our keynotes and panelists in order of appearance. So Simon Norfolk, Donald Webber, Zara Jamboy, Laurie Benson, David Cottrell, Exeter Medici, Mladen Miljanovic, Giles Price, Thomas Van Houtrup, Palumi Basu, Aletha Casey, Harare Sarkisian, Alkita Zafar Ripi, and Azza Abu Ribe. Thank you for your participation. I also want to give special thanks to Pablo Durelia, who's sitting down there, lecturer in Law Studies at King's College London, whose help has been incredible in organising this symposium. So thank you very much, Pablo. And also particularly, I want to thank Vivian, whose sponsorship of my visit to King's has made this symposium possible. So thank you very much. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote conversation. This will be chaired by Dr. Paul Lowe from University Arts London. He actually gave a paper at the Sydney Symposium and chaired one of the sessions, and as well as chairing a session today and convening a session that will be chaired by Max this afternoon. So it's my great pleasure to have Paul again at today's symposium. So I'll pass you on to Paul to introduce the first keynotes, Simon Norfolk and Don Weber. Thank you.
So thank you very much. The format's going to be Don is going to give a short presentation, and then Simon, and then we're going to come back and have some conversation around some of the themes about the representation of conflict through photography and how photography operates as a medium, and then kind of question some of the strategies and techniques that people have been using to kind of critically engage with that, hopefully. So anyway, Don is going to begin.
Yeah, thank you. So happy to be here and share. This is a project, well, I'm going to show two projects. The first one I'm going to show is a work called War Sand, which was created over about 5 years. So it began in May of 2013 and released as a publication last year. And the second project I'm going to show is more of a research project using satellite imagery. But War Sand really begins for me in a very sort of simple place, and it begins with this little grains of sand, and the idea basically I had was the sand had memory. So what is the sort of traces that is still in a microscopic space? So thinking about this idea of memory and what does sand actually contain, around the same time I was also thinking of my grandfather, who was a great sort of raconteur, a great storyteller, and one of the stories that he told me was about these 9 British commandos that had to cross the English Channel over New Year's of 1943, surface on the shores of Normandy and gather sand samples. And their mission basically was to get these sand samples back to Churchill, let's say, and to test the sort of geologic strength of the beaches of Normandy, which then would become the invasion of D-Day. So this was a story that my grandfather told me when I was a little boy, and sort of thinking around this notion of what does sand contain, I decided to go to Normandy and just started gathering my own sand samples. Not quite sure what I was going to see, but I just thought, let's actually take a look at sand and start looking at, say, the material traces of something. So these are just a few images that I started making with an astrophysicist back in Canada. Graciously, he completely opened up his lab. He said, here's my graduate students, let's start taking a look. So at first, what we started to see were all different kinds of shapes, etc., of course, like snowflakes, but then we came across an image like this. And the little round ball on the left-hand side of the image is what they call a microspherule, and a microspherule is formed in a very dramatic, intense high heat. So there's sort of 2 ways that this ball can be formed. One way is through a meteoric explosion, effectively. The other way is probably through some kind of artillery. So at this point we were sort of, oh, so maybe there's more in this sand than just the sort of visible traces of geology, but there's a new kind of geology starting to surface within these beaches of Normandy. So what you see here is a closer version of the microspherule. As the hot molten iron spins in the air, it forms itself into a sphere. And as it spins, the scratches on this are actually from the air, sort of inscribing itself. So basically, from this point on, we started to realize that there's obviously something in this sand. So traces from a very particular day, June 6, 1944. And so we started using different kinds of imaging techniques. So this is a sample image from a scanning electron microscope. I'm not totally clear on how it works. I just know it looks for the chemical composition of geologic matter. So in the image, or in the middle of this image, there's a blue piece. That means it's iron, which we did some math and calculations and finding some recipes. Started to see that there are actually traces from June 6, 1944 within the sand. So that to me became an interesting starting point. So not only does sand have memory, it actually is keeping itself and becoming its own sort of character within this larger geology. Then there was an image like this, which I found quite fascinating because it's sort of, to me I found it paradoxical because this sort of crashed spaceship landing looking thing is actually inorganic matter. It's called a diatom. And the thing that looks organic is actually mechanical. This is actually a piece of shrapnel from D-Day. And what the diatom does is that it eats iron. It loves to eat iron, but as it eats the iron, it actually starts to kill itself. And as it kills itself, it turns itself into plankton or algae. And without plankton, you don't have any life in the sea. Without life in the sea, you don't have us, effectively. So this idea that, sort of going back at one point, I was sort of thinking, is war good? So what good can war actually do? And I was looking at this image in a very kind of strange conceptual way, sort of seeing how this kind of life in the sea starts to manifest itself through this sort of extreme levels of violence. And we actually did find out that these parts of Normandy, the beaches, are actually quite healthy in terms of the water content, I guess you could call it, because of such dense levels of iron within the sand. And then a last image here is what the scientist Dr. Robbie called cosmic space dust. And what he called cosmic space dust is basically something that's millions, if not billions of years old, that predates humanity, predates much of our geologic sense of time. And this to me is when the project started to shift and started to open, and I started to look at, or think about at least this notion of a narrative merger between myth and micron. So on the one hand, you've got the sort of forensic level of evidence, so the scientific images, but then I was also started to think of my grandfather, which comes from this, the mythological. So how is history actually performed for the present through the notion of storytelling? And then trying to look at it in a different scale. So I decided to go back to Normandy and just start walking the beaches and just to sort of see the traces or the locations of not necessarily where the battles took place, but look at Normandy in its sort of contemporary space. And so to look at the landscape as well as specific in a location and a history which is also scarred by spatial vectors and the movements across the face of the landscapes. So this is, I'll just show you a brief selection of some images from war sand, but what I found very interesting while I was traveling there is it's quite dotted with memorials and it's quite dotted with monuments to the war. But I tried to sort of, not necessarily evade that, but to sort of look at Normandy within its present condition. And I was reading what W.J.T. Mitchell was talking about landscape and this idea of what he calls spatial practices. So the rites, pilgrimages, tourism, etc., may then also activate the place and it may become the object of imaginary rendering. So postcards, descriptions, spectacles, fantasies, and memories. So that's sort of the shift in this project, but also what I started to think about with war sand is that there can be no single history, that it's not necessarily a chronological or a linear sense of time, but when you start introducing the concept of myths, this sort of starts to test this kind of chronological and forensic nature of conflict representation. So I think for me, the landscapes are really of the immediate present. I was very concerned and only looking for the immediate present, but also trying to connect it back to maybe a deeper sense of planetary time. And also Mitchell was talking that every history really has two histories. There's the history of what actually happened, and there's the perception of what happened. But I also think when you start looking, certainly in a place like this, which is also a seaside, to actually start looking into the sea also as a vector of time and as a vector of history and such, which happens, I believe, as sort of the liquid nature of time and history start to intertwine and sort of create a new construction, I guess, of those histories. So the sand or the beaches themselves, but also the seaside, I think, demand different forms of narrative, which can also change the spatial dimensions and such. So the idea with the project is that we start off from a very sort of microcosmic, and as the book sort of progresses, we expand outward into a macrocosmic space, and then it shifts into maybe a counter-narrative, effectively, of what of D-Day. You know, I come from Canada, and here we are in the King's College in the War Studies program, and I think we all know about the histories of D-Day, that it sort of plays within our mythological understanding of a sense of nationalism and identity and such. But I was sort of intrigued by how the sea itself can demand and create these different forms of narrative. And then sort of the last part of, well, not the last part, it's quite a big project, but sort of the last part on this that I'll show in more sand was starting to kind of look up into the skies, which is starting to produce a different sensibility, but also to expand out from the water in this liquid notion of time, but then to start seeing the sky as kind of a different kind of sky, or an embrace of conflict, and how can conflict still sort of linger within an atmospheric space, basically. Which then sort of brings me to a current project I'm working on. Use that term fairly loosely. But this idea of atmosphere and sky has kind of intrigued me lately, and you know, looking up to the heavens, looking up to the clouds and such, I see that we live in a different sort of time of sky. And sort of trying to think about this notion of enclosure or containment, these sort of infrastructures that really we are bound by, that we don't necessarily see. And so I was trying to think about what is sort of the material device that I can sort of latch onto that can actually sort of start to inscribe this enclosure of the atmosphere. So I was thinking of the military drone. Of course, it's everywhere and it's hyper-prevalence. It's not just military drones today, but of course commercial and hobbyists. But the idea was I just started to troll Google Earth effectively, started making a list and a map of all the different American drone bases. I'm still only contained within the American space. I just started looking for drones effectively and using the timeline tool and going back in time to sort of see what I could find. And I do find this project sort of sharing traditional senses of photojournalism, which is really about that not necessarily the factual truth, but the accumulation of a certain kind of knowledge that something exists and it's there and that you can point to it. And I was also interested, you know, thinking of this notion of sky, so this idea of the orbital, spectral, the material means where the drone needs to sort of operates. But also it operates through the algorithmic interface of Google Earth, which I think is a great narrative tool, which is turning data basically into stories, which I found quite interesting in order to make an information intervention effectively. Or another way is to look at it is to sort of find a node in the landscape of secrecy and to sort of reveal it. As a lot of rhetoric, of course, surrounding the drone program is really based in terms of it being hidden or classifiable, you know, off to the sides, basically. So this was sort of the drone project, or at least where it is now. As I said, I was sort of really only focusing at this point upon the American military infrastructure. And at one point I was sort of interested in the notion of resolution. At what point does what is visible and what is tangible and what is material actually start to sort of disappear under the pixels? And I learned that commercially I believe right now Google Earth is that you can have resolution of 50, so 1 pixel equals 50 centimeters, which is basically the width of somebody's shoulders. But below that, then a person disappears, which I thought was kind of interesting. So this kind of disintegration of knowledge, of violence is sort of with us. But kind of the way I'm heading now, going back to this notion of this node in the landscape of secrecy, as I was sort of scouring through Google Earth, I would sort of just be flying and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. One thing I started to look for as I became very adept at sort of understanding the infrastructure of where drones exist, which is basically, this is just a poor image, of the runways that the drones need to take off from. So the kind of methodology that I was thinking of at this time was this notion of counter-reconnaissance. So the inversion, watching the watchers of Deleuze, turning the prison inside out, using the tools to our advantage effectively. But what I started to see, and I think is a much more interesting maybe space to start investigating, is to look at the airstrip itself, which is not just a piece of asphalt, but it does mark its sort of terrain and its surface in satellite imagery. So these are just a couple of images that I found that's online, or again on Google Earth. But what's also interesting about the airstrip is that it also kind of represents the material condition of which that drone needs, which is physics, energy, geology, and weather that drones negotiate to actually operate. And so the last kind of conclusion that I'm getting to now is that the American government is switching from sort of a hub model to a model which they call lily pads. So a lily pad is a very mobile base, which is effectively something like this, or it can be a little bit bigger, but it allows sort of quicker deployment of drones and special forces. So they're not closing down, but reducing the size of, say, something like Ramstein in Germany or Diego Garcia, to sort of go for these much more flexible spaces. And the sort of irony in this is that the government then, on the one hand, can sort of talk about the American empire disintegrating in some hand, or consciously choosing to sort of shut it down, but in reality it's actually quite expanding. So right now I'm at about 270 different lily pads all across the world, including the United States, Africa, Middle East, and actually Africa is becoming the sort of front line of this lily pad strategy, which is crisscrossing up and down all across Africa. Basically, sometimes building their own infrastructure, but many of the times just appropriating what's already there, and also using commercial airports, so international airports such as in the Seychelles and Niamey. So those are two projects that I've been working on, I guess, since about 2013. And I think for me, it's really about trying to find that sort of material infrastructure of something that doesn't exist, because as a former photojournalist, now I guess as a current photojournalist, but in a different sort of kind of hat, I've always felt that the representation of war and violence has always been sort of the thing that is right in front of you. So kind of that notion of the decisive moment. But I was always more interested in the sort of remnants and the infrastructures of military and war and violence that never quite actually disappear. And I think that's, for me, also what war science represents. That long after we're gone, this infrastructure is still very much present. So that's that. Sorry to rush through it, but yeah, you can ask me questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, you go now and then we'll talk.
Okay. I'm going to show you a piece of work that I don't really show very much, really. It's not really entirely finished. I'm not quite sure what it's about. But it came about, it's designed really to be watched in awed, reverent silence, of course. But I'm going to talk over it. If you want to see it in its full form, you'll have to go to Cortona in July, which is the first time I'm going to be showing. But it's a project that came out of a long interest in the First World War, which I think is quite interesting to bring to this audience in particular, because so many of the devices which were invented in the First World War were absolutely cookie cutter copied and duplicated into Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India as the dominions. The devices that were created to remember the First World War were absolutely transformed and just absolute duplicates were cut out. Your cenotaph in Australia is a carbon copy of the one that's in Whitehall. And a lot of the devices that were invented at that time, which I think was the most creative period in British cultural history there's ever been, is that period from about 1919 to the middle of 1920, when we invented this thing called remembrance, official formal remembrance of warfare, which had never really existed before. That was the first time that those texts were written. That's when they invented things like the missing, the silence, the cenotaph, poetry as prayer. All of those devices were written in this amazing cultural period. I don't think Britain's really had a creative period like that before. So I'll talk over this, but it came about as a sort of an accidental import of a folder into a Keynote and it copied an import style, which was very, very slow, draggy blends from one picture to the next. 20-second blends between the two pictures, which was an accident. But it seems to me that it told me something very interesting. So I'll talk over this as it goes. But it was simply just, there's no intellectual connection between Rwanda in 1994, the genocide, and the battlefields of the First World War, except for I went to both of them, right? So it's just nothing other than my biography. But the pictures that I made of that, how do I do this? I swear that's not my picture. That's the picture by a photographer who got paid.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on there, yes. The Rwanda work is...
Is that what you want to do?
Yes. What was he doing over there? Okay.
Should be able to just press spacebar.
Yes.
Click on
And then it goes. Okay. So the pictures that I made in Rwanda was in a very, I was very much a photojournalist at the time. I was with black and white. I was interested in horror. I was sent by the Observer magazine to photograph the warfare, the residue of this genocide some months after the genocide had taken place. And I photographed it in a very kind of brutal, but very shocking kind of way, a way that I have to admit had a very deep personal effect upon me and actually caused me a great deal of trouble, a great deal of kind of pain, really, that I never really recovered from in some way. And I think that's kind of interesting where that ended up. And these are the pictures that I was making. Very beautiful pictures of the First World War battlefields and the remnants that lie behind, the traces that are left behind in these amazing cultural devices that were built in 1919, 1920, 1921, when the whole of northern France was turned into an open-air workshop to build the most beautiful statement about war memory that's ever been, which is the British war cemeteries of northern France. The French built 37 war cemeteries, the Germans built 29, the British built 1,248. It's like an archipelago across the whole of northern France and Belgium of these tiny cemeteries. What appeals to me about this little blend, which if you watch it properly with in its real version, it has the sound of a nightingale singing over the top of it. The nightingale is this classic English songbird. The nightingale is the bird which is referenced time and time again in all of the war memoirs. If you're a soldier standing on a fire step at 4 in the morning, what the hell else is there to do but listen to the only songbird that sings during the night time? So you find it appearing in Blundon and Sassoon, all the poetry constantly recognized, which has this amazing history through English poetry, through John Keats. What appeals to me about this series of pictures was that kind of rather fortuitously, I'm not so interested in this picture, which I made. I'm not too interested in the other picture, which I also made. I'm kind of interested in that. The halfway thing. The halfway thing is this uncanny, weird thing. The way that cross hangs in that sky, it almost looks like I'm kind of trying to mash the pictures together. It's just as it on auto. Right? It's just auto. And yet sometimes the elements hang and hang and hang like they don't want to leave. It's completely bizarre. And I kind of think that I've seen all the tricks in the book, and yet this astonishes me. And you can re-edit it, and you can re-sequence them, and then you get some whole load of new stuff. So I think this is liminality, in an interesting kind of way, which is a much misused word around these parts. But also this is something which is something about automatic processes that are creating these pictures, which I certainly didn't generate, which are much more interesting in my pictures, I think, these strange halfway things. But also what I like about this piece of work is it is about guilt and about beauty, because Northern France in 1918 did not look like these cemeteries of these neat flower beds and these beautiful, perfect plantings of flowers and this perfect stonework and these lawns so smooth you could play croquet on them. They are meant to be played croquet on these lawns, and tennis and cricket and all these great games of the British Empire. It didn't look like this. It looked like Rwanda in 1918. The landscape was broken and smashed and stewed with dead bodies. 300,000 British soldiers, just the British soldiers, 300,000 British soldiers had been there that day but had been vaporized by artillery. No name, nothing, name but no corpse whatsoever, no remain whatsoever. And so you have this new activity, this thing called necronominalism, where we're compiling for the first time in history, great lists of names. 1.2 million names. No one had ever done that in history. Create a list of 1.2 million names of all the soldiers that were in this place, of whom 700,000 at the end of those wars, something like 700,000 were known to have existed and had been vaporized by high artillery. No war had ever done this before. No war ever had the power of artillery. And so I think what it comes across this is it's utterly shifty, right? This brutality of war, the random chaos and slaughter of Rwanda. And what you see now is it's all been tidied up and made to look gorgeous. It's all been swept away and made to look pretty under these perfect lawns, under this gorgeous stonework. And what we're left with instead are these little cottage gardens. And they are meant to be cottage gardens because this is a very British project. It's very much a thing about Englishness. If you go to the French war cemeteries, they look like warehouses. They're just colossal warehouses of the dead. Jeff Dyer says one of them, Notre Dame de Lorette, so big it seems to follow the curve of the earth. 47,000 soldiers in the place. The German cemeteries are kind of gothic. They're kind of ruthless. Oak trees, stone slabs, not a fucking daisy. I mean, like, not a daisy in the whole joint. And for the Germans, it would have been offensive to put flowers in a cemetery. Histrionic, theatrical. Soldiers died for Germany. It's the best thing that could happen to them. Germany is on its way to greatness, and you've taken part in it, and you should be thankful for that. Over the cemetery at Vladso, it used to say, so that Germany could live, they died. I mean, it's brutal stuff. The Italian cemeteries look operatic, they look like sets of a Verdi opera. But the British ones are meant to reference Oxford quadrangles, English cottage gardens, the courtyards and English country cathedrals. They are meant to look like these absolutely idyllic pieces of the English imagination. And these soldiers carried these ideas into the war with them. This is the first war where soldiers walked into war with a sort of literature of Shakespeare and Palgrave's Golden Treasury and a bit of Thomas Hardy and a bit of John Bunyan. They carried these literary things, and so it's natural that they would see the war in these through these devices, through these doors and windows. And so when it came to covering up the war and hiding the pain of it, the British establishment resorted to beauty in the way that only the English know how, and covered these things away with this kind of gorgeous, symmetrical, these flower beds and these plantings and these stonework. And that really appeals to me because my entire career has been about photographing the military landscapes and conflicts that are photographed as a kind of beauty. For me, beauty has always been a kind of tactical thing. This was the kind of the seduction, the kind of come hither. This is how I get you to look at my pictures of Afghanistan or even Rwanda, perhaps. Anyway, my photography works is I make it really gorgeous, and it goes, come. That's what I've done. 25 years we've done that. And I think the British know that this works. It's a very English way of dealing with pain, is to hide it behind a kind of shield of beauty. That's the only way the English know how to deal with the great traumas in their lives. And the English war cemeteries in northern France are classic, most beautiful portrayal, incredibly expensive, incredibly, the amount of attention that was put into it was extraordinary, and yet it's the most perfect format, which is why when people go and see the cemeteries in northern France, you kind of think that these things have always been around, that we've always remembered war like this, and we always remember war with silences and 3-minute silences and parades and cenotaphs. No, it was all invented in 1919 and 20 and 21, when this entire package appeared in the world so well thought out and so in tune with our national characters that people think it's existed forever, and it hasn't. It's invented. In recent time, just to sum up, I've started to worry about that sense of beauty and the effectiveness of anything I've ever done. Great the re-evaluation has been taking place this last year or two. But it is a feeling that pretty much the tactic that I employed 15 years ago I thought was incredibly clever and untitled smart way. And nowadays it seems like it's pretty much a failure. because I don't believe it ever really convinced anybody. And I think all that I did was I succeeded in kind of honeycoating and making palatable things that I was trying not to make palatable, like the war in Afghanistan. And when I look back through the war, the pictures that I made in Afghanistan 15, 20 years ago, it seems to me like they failed to have the kind of power that I wanted to. I wanted to rip people's throats out. And instead what I did was I made it gorgeous. And I always wondered why I was making these pictures so gorgeous. Well, why am I walking around Afghanistan trying to make the place look like an 8th, 17th century landscape painting? Well, I think that's my reaction to what happened to me in Rwanda. And, you know, I think the pain that I felt about what I saw in Rwanda, I was hiding as well in some ways. You know, I think that explains why on earth was I walking around with that camera in Afghanistan, because I think I was also on the run from the feelings that I felt. And I used beauty to shield myself and hide myself, and I think that is a supremely English attitude. It's the only thing I feel really qualified to talk about is my Englishness and my English abuse of beauty. That do?
Thank you. Don, do you want to come back? So to continue on that kind of self-flagellation of the medium, a lot of your work, for both of you, is seen in no longer in the context of the magazine, but in the context of the gallery. So do you think the gallery space is also problematic in the way that's representing conflict? In other words, can we find a way to represent these kind of themes in a way that an audience can actually engage with in some sort of real way? You know, what is the forum you should be working with?
Well, I've never exhibited in a gallery, and I've never exhibited my work in a fine art context because I don't necessarily see it as art per se. But one thing I sort of forgot to mention with the drone work is I've also been sort of thinking about how can work actually participate within society without me as the kind of the primo supremo, as the author, to sort of de-author the photography and allow it to be exchanged and networked and transmitted and such. And so what I've been thinking with the drone work is I've started to upload it into Google Maps now, all of these different drones and all the different bases. And then also in Wikipedia, which is taking a long time. People keep deleting it, which I find very interesting. But a different conversation actually starts to happen outside of me, which I think is actually the most important thing, where photography can start to exist in maybe not necessarily a mass medium, but a medium that sort of is disconnected from the intent of the author, I guess. I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out. Which also makes me think back to the Soviet era in the 1920s, where they had this idea that we're in a new era, we're in a time, a very particular contemporary time, and I also believe we are living in a very particular moment, and a special moment that has lots of potential for catastrophe. But the Soviets were sort of looking to like newsprint and to the magazine and to the mechanical image effectively to sort of just get it out there. And so the photography becomes a part, I guess, of that medium. And I think, for me, it's kind of interesting to completely disengage from, say, the discipline of photography itself, but use photography as a way to sort of maybe instigate certain questions. So fine art can, I don't know, exist somewhere else, I guess.
Well, I have shown a lot in galleries. And I make a living, really, from my print sales, or about half of my living is from my print sales. I've always rather loathed it, really loathed it. The people that I've met via it are mostly space cadets, some kind of ADHD space cadets, certainly the very wealthy people that I've met, quite bizarre. I only ever really tolerated it because I needed the money. And what I do is quite expensive. And it was a quick way of making money. It was not an audience for me. It was never an audience that I was interested in. The audiences are too small. There's just not enough people going to galleries. Having a show in a gallery was a way of getting a spread in the New York Times magazine, which for me is an audience. You know, that's 1.6 million people, that's an audience. 3,000 people going in the photographer's gallery is not an audience. It's not the reason why I went to Afghanistan. It's not the reason why I terrified Mrs. Norfolk either. It was simply a kind of access. There is a second thing to galleries, which is that in the US, galleries is a way of being placed into museums. and placing the work in museums does a little bit still interest me in terms of inserting work into some kind of, the great slab of what there will be, one of them will be mine, slide it in there, sort of thing. But the gallery audience never interests me at all. I think there are reasons why the arts are state funded in this thing. It's because they are powerless. Because nothing radical ever comes out of the museum. That's why the state pays for galleries, because they are sucked away of any of their radical value. And nowadays I have a large Instagram, and I'm much more interested about thinking about Instagram and how it works, and my direct access to that, rather than going via a curator in a museum or gallery.
So Simon, your first book was called Curatopia, sort of second book, referencing that Baktian idea of time and space being fused together. And it struck me that the drone work using the Google backtracking is actually almost literally representing that sense of layering of time on top of it. When you're sort of working through that, and you've dealt a lot with these different registers of time, how do you kind of knit all of that together in your process, of when your research process and when you're working?
Interesting question. Well, for me, it's just sort of, I think, an organic unfolding of something. So for me, it's very important just to, I think, begin something and to see it and to look at it. So with War Sand, the first thing I needed to do was just go to the beach and look at the beach, and then take a sample of sand and then look at the sand, but also very much how that microscope, say, reacted to the sand, which then I think reveals other questions. In terms of the drone work, I think it's the same thing. The timeline tool, actually, I found very interesting. Google Earth is very interesting because it's a completely temporal document. I mean, it's always changing and shifting. So as time progresses, so does Google Earth. And I keep going back to some of the same locations, and I have noticed that certain things have been deleted, but then certain things get added. So that, for me, was kind of interesting to kind of like dip into Google Earth and actually take something, almost by the hand and sort of pull it out to sort of, stop it from actually constantly shifting. But I also think that's very kind of contradictory to what photography is as well with Google Earth, because it is, I mean, just the other day I was looking at there, and they hadn't uploaded anything for a year in this specific location, and suddenly there was an image there. So, yeah. But I think also as a photographer, in terms of process, for me it's also very much time-based, where I don't necessarily anticipate what it is that I'm doing, but only through the notion of investigation or of looking, then the actual questions arise through the time that's given.
So you said earlier on that you're kind of doing a kind of new form of photojournalism, but it seems to be very much based on kind of investigative journalism approach. What would you call that process?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a new form of photojournalism, but just sort of maybe looking at what photojournalism sort of started out way back in the 1920s and 1930s, that sort of pre-war era of documentary photography. But now with the drone project, and another thing I'm working on now is this notion of research storytelling, which is kind of contradictory, but the research is basically kind of grounded in a certain sense of investigation. As with the storytelling, I believe, and that's what War Sand sort of revealed to me, is that there needs to be sort of multiple narratives and counter-narratives. And so there is a little bit of confusion. I know we had a discussion about this last night, but I don't necessarily see what I'm doing as an ultimate arbiter of truth, but rather as a sort of well, first and foremost, I think I, as the photographer, need to sort of investigate certain situations and conditions that we are living in within a very contemporary moment. But I also think it's important to sort of then put that out there and share the sort of outcomings that I've found to allow other people to sort of understand their own sort of narrative within that space. Hence the idea with the drones to go to Wikipedia. I've been using Amazon actually also to sort of post images in there, and then to sort of let the traffic of the image itself actually create its own context and meanings and such.
So you've got a very research-driven process as well, in terms of the amount of background material that you read through. How does that then make itself sort of visible, as it were, when you actually go out in the field with the camera to make the picture? How does all that kind of knowledge make itself actually tangible in the photograph?
I've always thought that's one of the great kind of problems of photography, is that it can't carry very well. It's quite a very poor load-bearing mechanism, I find. And great scabs of stuff gets left behind. The photography, you know, when you're working on a project, you're finishing a project, you bring it down to a book, or you bring it down to an exhibition wall, is about removing and dumping and dumping and dumping and dumping. And then what you actually put on the wall is a tiny, tiny portion of what you had in the first place. Which is why recently I've been thinking much more about making television programs. Because it seems to me a television program is something, an hour-long TV program, is something that you can stack up. You pile it and you accrete to get to that 1 hour sort of length, you know. Whereas photography is always about this reduction, about down to essence and very simplistic 8 statements on a wall or 200 words of text, you know, it's like draw it down. So I've kind of veered away from photography recently, and I've been trying to write television programs, not very successfully, but I very much like the idea of TV as a format, presenting all of this stuff, because an hour is quite a long time. It's much more like a lecture.
But isn't it in that distillation, that kind of paying attention to things that otherwise go unnoticed, and that distillation of everything down into this still image that photography's power is that not kind of where it all lies?
It's power and it's powerlessness, yeah. Because I think by doing that, you leave a lot of audience behind. It becomes something rather la-di-da and rather artsy-fartsy, and that has problems of audience about what's the class of people that go to galleries, what's the kind of people that can afford £60 for a coffee table book. These are not problems that you have with Instagram. It's not problems I have with a website. Even a kid in Afghanistan can access my website through his phone. So I've always been interested in those ideas of audience. I started out as a lefty standing outside railway stations trying to sell left-wing newspapers. And for me the problem was I knew it was full of great ideas, I couldn't get anyone to stop and buy one. The problem is, how do I get you to stop and buy one? And that's always been the challenge for me. Making a great large piece and putting it in a gallery and 1,000 people come and see it, what's the point of that?
Well, but I also think it's a question of context. And I think maybe you're I don't know, I feel a little bit you're looking at it as I think photography needs to be looked at as a contextual argument first and foremost. So if you're going to be in a commercial gallery or a fine art space, whatever, of course immediately then audience is gone. But I think if you're looking at an audience and you really have to think of the context that imagery actually sets in, as you say yourself, Instagram or websites or whatever, there are so many other different kinds of spaces that photography actually can participate and operate within, which is much more interesting than any of the fine art sort of spaces. And not to negate, say, fine art, because it does sort of have a purpose and such, but I also believe that photography has been so bound by its discipline, and in the universities, etc. You know, you're taught these are the things that you need to do to be a photographer. You need to be in these kinds of spaces. And also the kind of stranglehold that, say, liberal humanism has had over certainly photojournalism and documentary photography has meant that we've sort of always looked for the individual embodiment of a sort of like, you know, the human sort of embodies something, which then I find then it become quite limiting. But I think if we just shift our senses of the context of where our images can be, then I think we can actually reach audiences. And as you were saying last night, you want to change the world. Certainly not going to do it, I think, selling in a commercial gallery, but I think there are ways that photography can actually start changing.
No, I agree with that totally. What pisses me off is this rather stultifying thing that the only measure of success is the art photography MA and the big show with a big commercial gallery, and therefore now you've made it. You know, you're being represented by some big New York gallery. You've made it. Yeah. Whereas, you know, recently I'm much more into a photographer like, sorry to introduce it to you, Joey L. Anybody? Joey L. 900,000 followers on Instagram. He's a big deal. You should know about him. He's a wall photographer. You know, there are other metrics of what success is. But nowadays, you know, the success is the vanity published coffee table book, the fancy show with a big New York gallery, and that's the only metric, and a la-di-da MA. And it seems to me there's a vast amount of stuff out there that's going on which people don't even know about. They don't even know the names of the people doing it.
So, thank you very much, both. I think some great themes we've established there for the rest of the day, hopefully, about the nature. I mean, it's a very contested space, I think, which is exactly why we're here. The nature of showing this kind of conflict in any form of representation, I think, is exactly what we're interrogating today. Thank you very much to Simon and Don for that great start today.